Let's start this programme with a quiz question. Was the music that you're hearing now composed by the early 19th century German composer Beethoven, or by a plump, charming English medium, an amateur pianist called Rosemary Brown? It's not an easy question to answer, and I will show you why. You could say that Rosemary Brown takes the crown as the 20th century's most preposterous woman. After all, this is what she claimed about herself: that as a medium she had direct contact with over a dozen dead yet world-famous classical composers, and that she provided a channel for their latest music compositions sent to Earth. These pieces were to provide proof that there is indeed a life beyond death. And she takes no credit for composing this music herself. In this example, she says Beethoven was responsible. So far, so good. But imagine being in contact with all of the people that I'm about to list. And what about the means of communication with so many different nationalities? Rosemary's composers included the Hungarian pianist and composer Franz Lizst, the Polish pianist and composer Frederic Chopin, the Austrian composers Amadeus Mozart and Franz Schubert, Ludwig van Beethoven, the genius from Germany, and also from Germany, Johann Sebastian Bach and Johannes Brahms, as well as Clara Schumann and Robert Schumann. Also, the French composers Claude Debussy and also Hector Berlioz, and from Norway, Edvard Grieg. The Russian composers too, Sergei Rachmaninoff and Igor Stravinsky, and the Englishman Frederick Delius, as well as Victor Ullmann, a little-known composer from Silesia who died in the Auschwitz concentration camp. The good news for Rosemary Brown was the financial assistance from friends convinced of her talent, including the composer and educator Sir George Trevelyan, who established a trust, enabling her to work full-time on these compositions. But after 2 years, she ended the arrangement as she felt it placed her under an obligation she did not want. In addition to composers, Rosemary Brown says she communicated with many ordinary spirits of the dead, as well as more contemporary celebrities. Take, for example, Gracie Fields, an English actress, singer, and comedian who entertained the troops in World War II. Then there was Douglas Bader, the wartime flying ace who piloted Hurricane planes despite having lost one leg. There was Diana Dawes, the English actress who modelled herself on Marilyn Monroe. Fats Waller, the American jazz pianist who died in 1943, and John Lennon of the Beatles, who gave her a song or two, telling her to pass on the message that young people should stay away from drugs. Then there was Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, and George Bernard Shaw, the English playwright, who gave her from the other side 2 plays, one entitled Caesar's Revenge, which was performed at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 1978, and the other was called The Heavenly Maze. Also, there was the distinguished musicologist Sir Donald Tovey, who died in 1940. Despite his impediment of being dead, 30 years after his demise, he provided Rosemary with the music notes for her 1970 long play album entitled A Musical Seance. In these notes he said, and I quote, "Many ideas have been formulated to explain the emergence of the music, but the possibility that composers of the past are still alive in different dimensions from yours and endeavouring to communicate should not be dismissed too perfunctorily." Then, in addition to these musicians, there was the German theoretical physicist Albert Einstein, who contacted Rosemary, and Dr. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, who provided a commentary on psychology. It all seems just too amazing to be true. But we're not finished yet, as you'll see. As we continue, you, like me, will possibly be wondering if you're a gullible idiot to believe this stuff, since she also claimed to channel poems from some of the great literary figures in history, including Emily Bronte, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Rupert Brooke, William Blake, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, John Keats, Edward Lear, the English lyric poet Shelley, William Wordsworth, and finally John Betjeman. And there's still more. After she began taking art classes, dead painters who continued with their skills through her included Samuel Palmer, Joseph Turner, and Vincent van Gogh. So now you quite likely see her as a charlatan involved in magical thinking. With this massive list of illustrious contactees, surely she must be what in England we would call a nutcase or off her chump. I like the occasional pithy quotation, ones like, "Your mind is like a parachute, it only works if it's open." This is the challenge of Rosemary Brown. Can we keep an open mind in the face of the truly preposterous? She was born in 1916 to a family fallen on hard times. They lived in Balham in South London, and poverty was the keynote of her life, both as a child, and her lot was not much improved later as a wife and a widow. We're told that psychics ran in the family, including her mother and grandmother. Rosemary was still a toddler when she first remembered seeing spirits. She thought it normal and had to learn that other people could not see or hear what she was experiencing, so she better not speak of it to others. The most important event occurred when Rosemary was just 7 years old. She awoke one day to find a ghost standing by her bed. His hair was long and white, and he wore a cassock. He told her he'd been a composer and a pianist during his lifetime, and that he would return one day to give her music. Rosemary remembered this for the rest of her life, having no clue who the man was until she saw a picture years later of Franz Lizst, who died in 1886. This was the introduction to her musical destiny. As a child, Rosemary contracted polio, leaving her left side weak, but she still had to find work as she grew up, becoming a post office clerk from the age of 15. In 1948, she bought a used upright piano, taking lessons for 3 years. And in 1952, she married Charles Brown, a journalist with whom she had 2 children. Whether Rosemary was a trained musician has been the subject of much debate. She said she learned to play the piano, not very well, with lessons taken only sporadically throughout her life. Given her achievements in composing, one critic suggested she had amnesia about being a thoroughly trained musician. And this excerpt from a TV show does indicate she had at least a reasonable talent, if not concert-level ability. She's sitting at a piano in a TV studio, playing a classical piece from memory, which in my book is an achievement in itself. When Rosemary channeled music for her famous composers, she took down pieces beyond her own ability to play them. She said the spirits did not want her to be too good a musician, that Franz Lizst claimed, "You have sufficient training for our purposes. Had you received a full musical education, it would have been of no help to us. That would have made it harder to prove that you could not be writing our music yourself. Secondly, with a full music background, you would acquire too many ideas and theories of your own, an impediment to us." In 1961, Rosemary was widowed, leaving her with 2 small children and no income. Then 3 years later, one afternoon in 1964, Franz Lizst turned up in her life as he had promised to do. At the time, she was a lowly paid school kitchen assistant and was recuperating at home after slipping over a carrot in the school canteen, an accident that caused broken ribs. Franz Lizst became Rosemary Brown's main guide and spirit friend, introducing the other composers to her and organising their plan to prove that death is transition to another life. There's no doubting Rosemary's abilities. She published her channeled sheet music and wrote several books about her life, including Unfinished Symphonies, published in 1971, Immortals at My Elbow, published in 1974, Immortals by My Side came along in 1975, and Look Beyond Today was published in 1986. And it's clear from these books that her composers lost none of their distinctive personalities on crossing over, although she says they've generally grown younger while in the astral plane. She revealed that their working styles varied greatly. For example, Schubert would sing his songs to her, although she thought he didn't have a very good voice, while Beethoven at first impressed his music on her mind without speaking. Bach, on the other hand, preferred to tell her the notes while she wrote them down at a table, because he disliked her piano playing, while Chopin called out the notes as he pushed her fingers to the right notes on the piano. Her so-called collaboration with the composers included a 40-page Schubert sonata, plus 12 more songs, a fantasy impromptu in 3 movements by Chopin, and 2 sonatas by Beethoven. Some critics were suspicious that most, but not all of her work, was simply for piano, and she admitted having great difficulty taking down orchestrations. But there's no doubt that each work exhibits the stylistic features of its alleged composer. After the death of her mother and husband, within a few months of each other, Rosemary turned to spiritualism for comfort, and for a while she played the organ at her local spiritualist church, very badly by all accounts. She was a religious woman, and it was the spiritualist learning about her channeled compositions that helped launch her celebrity. Word spread to the BBC radio programme Woman's Hour, which featured her work. This led to a BBC television documentary about her in 1969. In this programme, they sat Mrs. Brown down at a piano and waited for Franz Lizst to come through. In due course, he appeared to her and dictated a piece called Grübelei, which she completed quite quickly. Like much of Liszt's music, it was far beyond her technical competence to perform, so they got someone else to play it. Humphrey Searle, a specialist in the works of Liszt, said of this piece, "It's highly chromatic and remarkably characteristic of Liszt's last few years. One hand is written in 5/4 time against 3/2 in the other. This isn't something Liszt ever did as far as I know, but it's the sort of thing that he might have done." He emphasized the advanced harmonies and tonality typical of Liszt's late compositions. What a contrast this view is to that of psychologist Robert Kastenbaum. There are no striking themes, complex structures, or depth of feelings, he said. No harmonic, tonal, or rhythmic innovations. Nothing new shows up to enrich these post-mortem compositions, and nothing surprises, except perhaps the lack of surprise. So it's a matter of whether you trust a sceptical psychologist or a musician specialising in the works of Lizst. Subsequently, Rosemary appeared on the BBC Start the Week programme, on the Russell Harty TV show, and on chat shows in Holland, France and Ireland, on the David Frost show and the Johnny Carson show in New York, and she also featured in the press. In 1974, Rolling Stone magazine wrote about her under the title Ditties from Heaven. She also gave a New York piano recital. But while she enjoyed the Americans' enthusiasm, the strain began to tell. She suffered an angina attack in New York. Her growing fame resulted in commercial recordings of her music by concert pianist Peter Caton in 1970, by Howard Shelley in 1977, and by Leslie Howard in 1988. Referring to the Peter Caton recordings, the Harvard music critic Michael Ryan said, and I quote, "The marvel of Rosemary Brown is not that she has created these pleasant little works, but that she has convinced so many seemingly qualified people that there is some degree of authenticity to her claims." Ryan denied the possibility of an afterlife or any evidence supporting it. If you want to judge for yourself by listening to her music, just type the name Rosemary Brown into YouTube and you will find free video renditions there. To the embarrassment of Rosemary's teenage children, their modest home in Balham welcomed many of classical music, great and good. The composer Richard Rodney Bennett, the concert pianist Tamas Vacheri, Hepzibah Menuhin, Peter Caton and John Lill, also Humphrey Searle and Julian Lloyd Webber. Leonard Bernstein invited her to his suite at the Savoy Hotel in London and played some of her pieces. She reported he liked very much the Fantasy Impromptu by Chopin. In fact, he liked a great many of the pieces, Liszt's, Schubert, Beethoven and the Rachmaninoff. Mr. Bernstein took to it greatly and played with great brilliance and remarkable speed. There was only one Rachmaninoff piece he didn't seem to like, but Rachmaninoff has since embellished that. I should emphasise that none of her distinguished visitors described Rosemary Brown as a fraud, but nor did everyone fully accept her explanation of where these compositions came from. All were impressed by her sincerity and sensitivity. Many became lifelong friends. But she had vocal critics too. Quote, "Some of the cheap journalism on my work with the composers has been positively libelous," she remarked. "I think there was always the underlying belief I would be exposed as a charlatan, but no one has been able to label my music as fraudulent in any way." And she added, "Many eminent pianists believe in my work, but won't risk playing it for fear of being ridiculed." Andre Previn, the conductor of the London Symphony Orchestra at the time, said of her work, if these were original works by Liszt and the others, they were compositions they would have left on the shelf. Alan Rich, the music critic of the New York Magazine, described them as substandard reworkings of some of their better-known compositions. While Michael Ryan in the Harvard Crimson Daily newspaper commented, "She has in fact been a mediocre pianist for many years and is familiar with the styles of many composers. These works could easily have been faked by anyone with some slight musical experience." He credited her with musical mimicry, able to reproduce the styles of classical masters, just as, say, Liberace or the English honky-tonk pianist Winifred Atwell or Victor Borgia could do. However, the enthusiasm shown by other eminent musicians suggests her abilities went far beyond those of an entertainer. The British composer Richard Rodney Bennett, for one, "A lot of people can improvise," he said, "but you couldn't fake music like this without years of training. I couldn't have faked some of the Beethoven myself." The concert pianist John Lill repeatedly spoke in support of Rosemary Brown and was consequently ridiculed by some of his fellow musicians. Peter Katin, a leading interpreter of Chopin, was so impressed that he recorded many of her piano works. The concert pianist Hephzibah Menuhin, the sister of violinist Yehudi Menuhin, insisted there's no question but that she is a very sincere woman. The music is absolutely in the style of these composers. While Malcolm Troup of London's Guildhall School of Music declared Mrs. Brown to be, and I quote, utterly amazing. I have played some pieces by her, particularly the works of Schubert, he said, and they are absolutely charming. I would never guess they were not by Schubert. They are in character and essence, the very heart of his work. In 1978, Ian Parrott, Emeritus Professor of Music at the University of Wales, published an entire book, The Music of Rosemary Brown, sympathetic to the thesis that the music bears the original hallmarks of the purported composers, which it would be difficult for subsequent professional musicians consistently to achieve. The pianist Hélène Gouche says, while they're not gigantic works of technical virtuosity, many require fairly advanced pianistic skills. One finds successions of 4 and even 5-note chords in each hand, as well as passages using crossed hands. Considerable speed is often called for. Some of the pieces are surprisingly lengthy. Liszt's Woodland Waters, for example, runs to 14 pages, and she adds, it's impossible to believe that this music was produced by purely normal everyday means, simply saying that it's fake. So what can we conclude from this controversy? Firstly, nobody who investigated Rosemary concluded she was consciously lying about her psychic experiences. Professor Tenhaeff of the Parapsychology Department of Utrecht University in Holland did an in-depth personality analysis of Rosemary and pronounced her to be of sound mental balance, not in the least anxious to occupy the limelight, and he added, my collaborator, an asylum psychiatrist of many years' experience, was unable to find a single mental aberration. Neither did our psychodiagnostic examination give reason to conclude any deviation whatsoever. She is one of the most likable and one of the most level-headed people we have investigated. It would be appealing to conclude that Rosemary really was in touch with the great creative minds of the dead composers, that she worked with them as their instrument and channeled their beautiful music. How else can we explain how someone with modest musical abilities could have produced them without supernormal contact? The skeptics insist these works were the production of her subconscious personality, whatever that means, and nobody has ever come up with a convincing, logical explanation for the music's existence. Personally speaking, I could buy the possibility of her being in touch with these composers on the other side, since if books can be channeled from the other side by mediums, why not music also? But for me, the problem is all that myriad of other famous artists, poets, scientists, philosophers and celebrities she supposedly had contact with. It's hard to swallow just the sheer quantity of them. That is what leaves me questioning her authenticity slightly. She knew that others would have this problem too. In her book Unfinished Symphonies is the following comment beneath one of the book's photographs. Quote, The most engaging feature of Rosemary Brown's disarming manner, it says, is her unreserved acceptance of people's scepticism. Well aware that many who visit her simply cannot believe her story, she nevertheless remains completely certain of all her claims. In the foreword to this book, Mervyn Stockwood, the Bishop of Southwark at the time, writes, "Rosemary Brown's experiences stand out as a challenge and a signpost for the discerning. There is a world beyond this one, and if we did but know it, we live out our lives in the shadow of eternity." Ultimately, the visits by her paranormal composers slowed down, as in old age Mrs. Brown's health declined. She died on the 16th of November 2001, aged 85. Regardless of what you conclude from this video about its validity, the compositions of Rosemary Brown stand out as some of the most mysterious and unlikely ever written. If you have the chance and interest to do so, take a look at the 1969 documentary entitled Music Beyond the Veil. It's posted on YouTube. The camera work and direction are rather amateurish, and the picture is far too low definition. But the whole programme you may find rewarding to watch. Thanks for listening.